The morning sun cast long shadows across RAF Kenley's tarmac as Beatrice Shilling watched Squadron Leader Davies climb into his Hawker Hurricane. It was 0742 hours on March 14, 1941, and what happened in the next few hours would determine whether British pilots continued dying from a preventable mechanical failure or whether her unauthorized modification would revolutionize aerial combat. At 32 years old, after 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Shilling had identified the problem killing RAF pilots faster than German bullets. Now she was about to test her solution without official permission, without proper authorization, and with a young pilot's life hanging in the balance. The statistics were grim. In the past week alone, the Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters across the English Channel. RAF pilots had engaged them in 27 separate dogfights, losing 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires. The pattern repeated with deadly consistency. British pilot spots, German fighter, pushes into a dive to attack, engine cuts out. German fighter escapes, or worse, circles back to destroy the helpless British aircraft while its pilot desperately tries to restart the stalled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Shilling understood the physics behind these failures with crystal clarity. The Merlin engine's SU carburetor used a float chamber design that worked perfectly under positive G forces, but failed catastrophically during negative G maneuvers. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed forward into a sudden dive, fuel surged to the top of the float chamber, flooding the carburetor. The fuel jet starved, the engine died, and for 1.5 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat, the British fighter became a gliding target. The Germans suffered no such handicap. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection, eliminating the float chamber entirely. Bf 109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, and invert their aircraft without losing power for even a fraction of a second. This technical advantage translated directly into tactical superiority. German pilots exploited it ruthlessly, deliberately luring British fighters into diving attacks, knowing the Merlin engines would fail at the critical moment. For 11 months, Shilling had worked on this problem while the engineering teams at Rolls-Royce pursued a comprehensive solution, a complete redesign of the fuel delivery system incorporating a pressure carburetor. But their timeline stretched to 1943, perhaps 1944. The war wouldn't wait. Every morning, young men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing their own engines might betray them at the worst possible moment. Squadron Leader Davies represented everything at stake. 24 years old with 41 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills, he'd reported engine failure twice in the past month, both times during combat dives, both times surviving through a combination of exceptional skill and pure luck. As he walked past Shilling toward his Hurricane, he nodded politely, unaware that she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough, or that she carried in her leather satchel a modification that might save his life. The solution had come to Shilling through elegant simplicity. If fuel flow couldn't be controlled during negative G maneuvers, why not restrict it mechanically? Not completely, just enough to prevent flooding while still supplying adequate fuel for combat power. She'd machined the first restrictor herself, a brass disc precisely 0.125 inches in diameter, with a 0.24-inch hole in the center. Those dimensions weren't arbitrary. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve at full throttle. 17 different prototypes had failed before she found the perfect specification. Bench tests at Farnborough proved the concept worked. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative G conditions without significantly impacting engine performance. But bench tests weren't combat. Combat meant 300-mile-per-hour dives, negative G-forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness, split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences. The only way to truly test the restrictor was to install it in a combat aircraft and send it into battle. Official channels would have taken months, forms to complete, committees to convince, liability concerns to address. If the restrictor failed and a pilot died, whoever authorized the modification would face court-martial. Shilling decided to bypass the bureaucracy entirely. She'd install the restrictor without permission and deal with the consequences later, assuming there was a later. Sergeant William Cooper proved the perfect accomplice. A Merlin engine specialist with 3 years' experience, he'd watched 19 pilots die from engine failures. When Shilling showed him the brass washer and explained its purpose, he didn't hesitate. While Davies completed his pre-flight checks, Cooper worked with practiced efficiency. Disconnecting the fuel line took 30 seconds. Welding the restrictor in place took another 30. Reconnecting the line and checking for leaks completed the installation in under 2 minutes. The modification was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. As Davies' Hurricane roared to life, Shilling felt the weight of her decision. She'd just sent a man into combat with an unauthorized modification that existed only in her workshop and her calculations. If it failed, if her math was wrong, if the weld didn't hold, if any one of a dozen variables didn't align perfectly, Davies would die, and his blood would be on her hands. The Hurricane gathered speed down Kenley's runway, lifted off, and climbed into the morning sky. Shilling watched through binoculars as Davies joined 2 other Hurricanes, forming a standard 3-aircraft section. They turned south toward the Channel, heading for the Dungeness patrol area, where German fighters had been active all week. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he'd have to dive. The restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. There was no middle ground. 40 minutes of agonizing silence followed. Shilling and Cooper waited on the tarmac, neither speaking, both calculating the implications of failure. Ground crews prepared aircraft for the afternoon patrol. Mechanics shouted across the dispersal area. A fuel truck rumbled past. Normal sounds of a fighter station at war that Shilling barely registered. Her mind was 15,000 feet above the Channel, running fuel flow calculations over and over. At 0937 hours, the radio finally crackled to life. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Shilling raised her binoculars and counted the dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft, no losses. The Hurricanes entered the landing circuit, with Davies touching down first. As he taxied to dispersal and shut down the engine, Shilling noticed something unusual. He was smiling. Combat pilots rarely smiled after patrols. They looked exhausted, haunted by near misses and fallen comrades. Davies looked exhilarated. Cooper asked the crucial question. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then Shilling. then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." The encounter had unfolded exactly as Shilling hoped. Davies spotted 2 Bf-109s at 14,000 feet, heading east toward France. With altitude advantage, he positioned his section for a diving attack, the exact maneuver that should have killed his engine. At 400 miles per hour, negative G-forces lifted him against his harness straps, but the Merlin kept running at full power throughout the entire dive. Davies closed to 200 yards before the German pilots reacted, fired a 3-second burst that struck the left Messerschmitt's wing root, and watched both fighters flee toward France. For the first time in 11 months, he'd successfully pressed home a diving attack without engine failure. When Shilling explained the modification, the brass washer, the fuel flow restriction, the unauthorized installation, Davies stared at her for 5 seconds before turning to Cooper with immediate decision. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station. Today." Authorization concerns evaporated in the face of operational necessity. Davies didn't care about regulations or proper channels. His squadron had lost 19 pilots to engine failures in 6 months. If installing an unauthorized modification meant court-martial, they could prosecute him after the war. Right now, his pilots needed engines that worked. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. Over the next 3 days, 5 modified aircraft flew combat patrols with 0 engine failures. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly. Some claimed even better than before, with improved performance at altitude. Word spread through fighter command's informal network at lightning speed. Within 4 days, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. They all wanted it immediately. The challenge now became production. Shilling had hand-machined 6 restrictors in the RAE workshop, adequate for proof of concept, but woefully insufficient for the hundreds of Hurricanes and Spitfires needing modification. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, quality control, and inevitably official approval from the Air Ministry. The bureaucracy that might have strangled the project before testing now embraced it with enthusiasm. The Air Ministry fast-tracked Shilling's proposal, designating it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the production contract and tooled up to manufacture 500 restrictors per week. Installation would begin immediately at every fighter station in Britain, with Shilling personally overseeing the initial deployments. She assembled a small team, 3 engineers from Farnborough and 2 civilian mechanics, to tour RAF stations and supervise installations. The restrictor's brilliant simplicity allowed installation without removing aircraft from service. In 12 minutes, a competent mechanic could modify a Merlin engine and have it ready for combat. This was crucial. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons even temporarily. Loading her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors, Shilling began a tour that would take her to 43 RAF stations across Britain. She knew every fighter base in southern England from pre-war visits, understood their operational tempo, and had established relationships with ground crews who now welcomed her as a savior rather than dismissing her as someone's secretary. Biggin Hill came first. the busiest fighter station in 11 Group with 32 Spitfires and 21 Hurricanes rotating through continuous combat operations. Group Captain Malin had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in 2 months and wanted restrictors installed immediately. Ground crews worked in shifts, modifying 4 aircraft at a time, while Shilling personally inspected every installation, checked every weld, and rejected any restrictor that didn't meet her exacting specifications. The pilots watched with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a Cambridge engineering graduate with 41 combat missions, immediately grasped the elegant physics behind Shilling's solution. He called it brilliant simplicity, solving a complex problem with a 50-cent brass washer instead of redesigning the entire fuel system. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Shilling moved to Hornchurch, then North Weald, then Tangmere, maintaining a punishing schedule that saw her riding her Norton through blackout conditions to reach the next station. At each base, the pattern repeated, ground crews working 12-hour shifts, pilots flying combat patrols with modified engines, and 0 failures reported. The restrictor acquired a nickname that would follow it through history. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, dubbed it Miss Shilling's Orifice, crude British military humor that Shilling accepted with good grace. She'd spent 6 years working with RAF personnel and understood how they processed stress through irreverent nicknames. If it helped them remember the modification, she'd tolerate any amount of impropriety. German intelligence quickly noticed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe, after action reports from April 1941, mentioned improved RAF diving attacks and the disappearance of the Merlin engine's negative G weakness. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer rely on British engines failing at crucial moments. The tactical advantage had evaporated. The statistics told the story with stark clarity. In March 1941, before the restrictor's introduction, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks. Pilots were forced to break off pursuit, allowing German fighters to escape or counterattack. Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires while destroying 61 German aircraft, a barely sustainable 1:3:1 ratio. April's numbers reflected the transformation. Engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%, with the few remaining failures attributed to battle damage or unrelated mechanical issues. 29 British fighters were lost against 94 German aircraft destroyed, a 3.2:1 ratio that shifted the mathematics of attrition decisively in Britain's favor. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines across Fighter Command, Coastal Command, and training units. New aircraft rolling off production lines came with restrictors pre-installed. The modification that began as an unauthorized experiment had become standard equipment in just 4 weeks. The restrictor remained in service well beyond its intended temporary role. When Rolls-Royce finally introduced the pressure carburetor in January 1943, converting existing aircraft required extensive modifications and 8 hours per engine. Time Fighter Command couldn't afford to lose aircraft from operations. Many Spitfires and Hurricanes flew with Miss Shilling's Orifice until 1944, some until war's end. Pilots trusted it, Ground crews understood it, and it worked. Shilling's contribution extended far beyond the restrictor. She developed cold-weather starting procedures for Spitfires operating from Murmansk in 40° F conditions, designed altitude-compensating mechanisms that improved engine performance by 8% above 30,000 feet, and researched dozens of other modifications that kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions. Each project saved lives, but none achieved the fame of the simple brass washer that solved an urgent problem with elegant simplicity. Recognition came slowly. In 1948, King George VI appointed her officer of the Order of the British Empire. She accepted the honor at Buckingham Palace, posed for photographs, then returned to work at Farnborough the next morning. Engineering was her life, and she continued solving problems for another 21 years, retiring in 1969 after 33 years of service. The restrictor's legacy transcended its wartime service. Engineering schools worldwide teach it as an example of elegant problem-solving under pressure, identifying the core issue, developing the simplest effective solution, and implementing it rapidly, despite bureaucratic obstacles. Museums display original restrictors as artifacts of innovative thinking, small brass washers that represent the difference between life and death for hundreds of pilots. Beatrice Shilling died on November 18, 1990, at age 81. The obituaries focused inevitably on Miss Shilling's Orifice, the modification that saved the Royal Air Force when it needed saving most. But her true legacy lies in demonstrating that the best engineering solutions are often the simplest, that bureaucracy should never impede life-saving innovation, and that one person with clarity of purpose can change the course of history. In those crucial weeks of March and April 1941, while committees debated and politicians deliberated, Beatrice Shilling acted. She identified a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it without waiting for permission. Her brass washer gave RAF pilots the confidence to press home attacks, shifted the arithmetic of aerial combat, and proved that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat can be measured in precisely 0.04 inches. Today, the Beatrice Shilling Building at Royal Holloway University houses electronic engineering students who may never have heard of carburetors or float chambers, but they study in a building named for a woman who understood that engineering isn't about complexity, it's about solving problems that matter. The Tilly Shilling Pub in Farnborough serves pints to patrons who might not know why it bears her name, but the brass plaque by the door tells her story. Beatrice Shilling, 1909 to 1990, engineer, motorcyclist, and savior of the Royal Air Force. Her personal life reflected the same determined independence that characterized her professional work. She'd met George Naylor at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1937, marrying him in September 1938, despite warnings from colleagues that marriage would end her engineering career. Instead, she kept her maiden name professionally, unusual for the era, and continued working while Naylor volunteered for RAF Bomber Command when war broke out. Their wartime separation added another layer of anxiety to her work. While she solved problems that kept fighter pilots alive, Naylor flew Lancaster bombers over Germany with 625 Squadron. 31 combat missions, each one a roll of dice against the law of averages that claimed 1 in 2 bomber crew members. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing an extra tour beyond requirements, a decision that terrified Shilling, though she never asked him to stop flying. They developed an unspoken agreement never to discuss their respective wars. He didn't describe the horror of night raids over Hamburg or Berlin, and she didn't explain the pressure of knowing pilots died when her modifications failed. They compartmentalized their marriage from their service, perhaps the only way to maintain sanity, while both contributed to the war effort in such different yet equally vital ways. The motorcycle remained her escape throughout these years. The same Norton she'd bought at 14, rebuilt with her own hands, and raced at Brooklands at 106 miles per hour, still carried her between RAF stations. Night rides through blacked-out countryside, navigating by instinct and memory, gave her time to think through engineering problems. Some of her best insights came at 70 miles per hour on dark roads, the motorcycle's engine note telling her things about mechanical harmony that no textbook could teach. Post-war recognition came in various forms, though never the senior positions at RAE that her contributions warranted. The institution's structure simply didn't accommodate female directors, regardless of achievement. Shilling accepted this ceiling with characteristic pragmatism. Administrative meetings would have taken her away from hands-on engineering anyway. She preferred the laboratory, the test bench, the satisfying challenge of making things work. Her later projects included contributions to the Blue Streak missile program, where she applied her fuel system expertise to the challenges of rocket propulsion. The wet runway braking studies she conducted in the 1950s seem mundane compared to wartime modifications, but they addressed a new generation of problems as jet aircraft brought higher landing speeds and new safety challenges. 3 technical papers on runway surface water effects might lack the drama of combat modifications, but they prevented accidents and saved lives just as surely. The bobsled project for the RAF Olympic team in 1964 showcased her versatility. Approaching the challenge with typical thoroughness, she analyzed the physics of ice friction, weight distribution, and aerodynamic efficiency. The team didn't win medals using her design, but they competed safely and effectively, a fitting metaphor for her entire career. Not seeking glory, just solving problems with quiet competence. Retirement in 1969 didn't end her engineering mindset. She restored vintage motorcycles with museum-quality attention to detail, occasionally racing at classic events where younger riders marveled at the elderly woman who could still push a Norton to its limits. The same motorcycle that taught her about engines in 1923 remained in her garage, maintained to perfection, a mechanical constant in a life of variables. The lasting influence of her work extends beyond the specific modifications she developed. The restrictor demonstrated principles that transcend its particular application. Identify the root cause rather than symptoms. Seek the simplest effective solution. Test rigorously, but implement rapidly when lives are at stake. And never let bureaucracy override urgent operational needs. These lessons apply whether engineering aircraft, designing software, or solving any complex problem under pressure. Modern engineers studying the restrictor often express amazement that such a simple device could have such profound impact. They're accustomed to complex solutions, elaborate systems, computational fluid dynamics, and sophisticated materials. The idea that a brass washer with a precise hole could save hundreds of lives seems almost quaint. Yet it worked precisely because of its simplicity, easy to manufacture, install, and maintain under combat conditions. The broader context of women in wartime engineering makes Shilling's achievement even more remarkable. She was one of only 2 women in RA's engine department, the other being a secretary. No support network of female engineers existed, no mentorship programs, no diversity initiatives. She succeeded through sheer competence and determination, earning respect from male colleagues who initially doubted women belonged in technical fields. Her influence on subsequent generations of female engineers, while difficult to quantify, was substantial. Simply by existing and excelling in her role, she proved that engineering ability has nothing to do with gender. Young women who entered technical fields in the 1950s and 1960s could point to Beatrice Shilling as evidence that they belonged there, not as tokens or exceptions, but as engineers capable of solving problems that mattered. The technical legacy of the restrictor informed post-war aviation development in subtle ways. It demonstrated that field modifications could be as effective as factory redesigns, encouraging a more flexible approach to aircraft improvement. The rapid development and deployment cycle from problem identification to fleet-wide implementation in weeks rather than years became a model for urgent modifications in other conflicts. Contemporary accounts from pilots who flew with the restrictor provide the most visceral testament to its importance. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, who destroyed 5 German aircraft in 2 months after installation, wrote, "Miss Shilling gave us our confidence back. Before her modification, every dive was a gamble. After it, we could fight the way we'd trained to fight." Flight Lieutenant Johnny Johnson, who would become the RAF's highest-scoring ace, credited the restrictor with enabling the aggressive tactics that made victory possible. The restrictor also highlighted the importance of informal networks in military innovation. Shilling's modifications spread through squadron-level connections before official channels even knew it existed. Pilots told other pilots, ground crews shared installation techniques, and operational necessity drove adoption faster than any bureaucratic process could have managed. This grassroots proliferation ensured the modification reached those who needed it most without waiting for administrative approval. Financial analysis reveals another dimension of Shilling's impact. Each Hurricane cost approximately £12,000 to build in 1941. Losing 47 fighters in March represented over £500,000 in destroyed aircraft, plus the irreplaceable loss of trained pilots. The restrictor cost less than $1 to manufacture and install. By preventing even a fraction of those losses, it represented one of the war's most cost-effective modifications. The human cost carries even greater weight. Training a competent fighter pilot required 18 months and substantial resources. Experienced combat pilots were irreplaceable assets whose loss degraded squadron effectiveness far beyond the mere absence of one aircraft. Every pilot saved by preventing engine failure in combat represented knowledge, skill, and leadership preserved for future missions. International recognition came slowly but steadily. The French awarded her the Croix de Guerre in 1948 for contributions to Allied victory. American aviation engineers studied her modifications in detail, incorporating lessons learned into their own design philosophies. Soviet engineers, receiving Lend-Lease aircraft with restrictors installed, reverse-engineered the concept for their own applications. The restrictors' influence extended to post-war civilian aviation. Airlines operating converted military transports discovered that engines modified with Shilling's restrictor showed improved reliability in civilian service. The principle of mechanical flow restriction found applications in various industrial contexts where simple, reliable fuel metering was required. Educational institutions began using the restrictor as a case study in the 1960s. MIT's Aeronautical Engineering program featured it in courses on practical problem solving. Cambridge included it in engineering ethics discussions. When is it acceptable to bypass normal procedures to save lives? The restrictor became a touchstone for debates about innovation, regulation, and responsibility. Personal testimonies from those who knew Shilling paint a picture of focused determination mixed with dry humor. Colleagues described her as formidably competent but approachable, willing to explain complex concepts to anyone genuinely interested in learning. Her patience with junior engineers contrasted sharply with her impatience for bureaucratic delays or technical incompetence. The final assessment of Beatrice Shilling's contribution to aviation history must acknowledge both the specific achievement of the restrictor and the broader impact of her career. She solved an urgent problem that killed pilots daily, implemented her solution despite institutional obstacles, and proved that engineering excellence transcends gender barriers. But perhaps most importantly, she demonstrated that the best engineers are those who understand not just how things work, but why they matter. In March 1941, faced with a problem that official channels claimed would take years to solve, Beatrice Shilling solved it in weeks with a brass washer and the courage to act without permission. That combination of technical brilliance and decisive action saved hundreds of lives and helped secure Allied air superiority when the margin between victory and defeat was measured in single percentage points. Her legacy reminds us that sometimes the most profound innovations are also the simplest, and that one person with clarity of purpose can indeed change the course of history. The restrictor remains a testament to engineering at its finest, not the engineering of complexity and sophistication, but the engineering of elegant solutions to urgent problems. In those dark days of 1941, when Britain stood alone and every fighter pilot was precious, Beatrice Shilling gave the Royal Air Force what it needed most: engines that wouldn't fail when courage demanded they dive into danger. With a piece of brass worth less than a pint of beer, she helped win a war. There is no higher achievement in engineering than that.